It's not
If
bright
it's too
enough.
bright. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, hello and welcome everyone to another PNP Live. My name is Sean Horsley. I'm part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we do get started today, just wanted to do a couple quick housekeeping things. The first is that we ask if anyone has any questions for, well, any of the panelists, but particularly the author, that you would direct them to the Q&A box, which can be found towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. The other matter is that if anyone at any point during the event would like to purchase a copy of Gambling with Armageddon, you can go to the chat box where we will have a link where you can go directly to the PNP website, purchase a copy of Gambling with Armageddon. We, of course, highly encourage you and thank you for your patronage if you do so. Now, this event is a little different than normal. This one is going to be in partnership with the Washington History Seminar. So, that said, I would like to introduce Eric Arneson and Christian Osterman, and they will take it from here.
The co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with co-chair Christian Osterman. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past 10 years, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. We have a full lineup of authors and books this fall, and I invite you to go to our organization's respective websites for the list of what we will be featuring over the next few months. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Christian Osterman. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's my great pleasure to invite my dear friend and colleague Marty Sherwin to talk for a moment about his book before we invite our commentators to provide some initial comments and questions. Before then, eventually, we'll open it up to all of our viewers for, I hope, a lively Q&A. Let me just say a couple of words about Professor Sherwin. Martin J. Sherwin is University Professor of History at George Mason University. His book, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, co-authored with Kai Bird, won the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for Biography, the National Books Critics Circle Award for Biography, and the English Speaking Union Book Award. He was elected to the membership of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has received fellowships from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Sloan Foundation. He was a visiting scholar at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, at Harvard's Charles Warren Center, and he's an alumnus, we're proud to say, at the Wilson Center of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He has served since 2010 as a senior advisor to the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project within the center's History and Public Policy program, and a lead faculty member of our annual Carnegie Corporation-sponsored Nuclear History Bootcamp in Almere, Italy. Professor Sherwin will now make some initial remarks, perhaps speaking to the question more broadly of why we need another book about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how he came to write this one, after which I'll introduce the commentators. Marty, the Zoom room is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, and thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Sayuri and Eric, and for doing all this. I taught the Cuban Missile Crisis for, I don't know, 45 years or so, and the more I learned about it, the more I felt it was a seminal event of the Cold War. And I also had a personal involvement. I was the air intelligence officer in my squadron in October 1962 in the Navy. And I remember having to carry the top secret deployment orders to my skipper on October 22nd, when just before Kennedy gave his blockade speech. We were going to deploy if there was a war to Baja California. And I, recall some joking among us junior bachelor officers. Baja California, what a great place to die. Well, I didn't realize how close we came until I did research for this book. It's not too much to say that we're all alive because the crisis ended peacefully. And my book has two parts. One, why the crisis was part of the Cold War, all the way from Hiroshima to October '62, and then a very close study of the Kennedy, of President Kennedy's thinking about how to deal with this crisis without starting a war. And of course, Khrushchev and Castro thinking too.
Thank you. Thanks, Marty. That's, I think, a perfect setup for our two distinguished commentators. We will start with Professor Elaine Tyler May, who's the Regents Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Minnesota. She's a past president of the Organization of American Historians, as well as the American Studies Association. She has taught at Princeton, Harvard, and as a distinguished Fulbright Chair in American History at University College in Dublin. She was the 2008 Douglas Southall Freeman Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Richmond. She has a number of books to her credit. Let me just mention Fortress America, How We Embraced Fear and Abandoned Democracy, published in 2017. America and the Pill, A History of Promise, Peril, and Liberation. And Homeward Bound, American Families in the Cold War Era, published in 1988, but in a new edition in 2017. She is also co-editor of Here, There, and Everywhere, The Foreign Politics of American Popular Culture. She's the recipient of a number of fellowships from, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Guggenheim Foundation. We're delighted to have her here with us today. She will be followed by Dr. Sayuri Ramey, who is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation here in Washington, D.C., where she researches Japan's evolving perceptions on U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. Prior to that, she was, we're again happy to say, a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a fellow for security and foreign affairs at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, and a MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. She holds a PhD in political science from Roma Tre University in Rome, Italy, and her work has been widely featured in the media, including in the Washington Post, the Kyoto News, the Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, among others. We'll start with Elaine, and then Sayuri will enter the conversation. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you, and especially to have an opportunity to be involved in this conversation about Marty Sherwin's extraordinary new book. And I know we don't have much time, and I'm sure we all have lots of questions, but I will just start with the issue of surprises. It felt to me reading your book, Marty, that every page was filled with surprises, things that I thought I knew something about, and then guess what? No, I was wrong. Everything I thought I knew turned out to be not true once I read how you had dug below the surface and really found out what was going on the ground, or even under the ground or underwater or wherever things were happening. And I wanted to begin by asking you, I was surprised on every page of your book. And I'm wondering if you were surprised at every moment of your research and how it felt to you and what surprised you the most when you were working on this project.
Thank you for that question, Elaine. I could have entitled the book Surprises, because I was surprised. Not for the Truman administration, which I knew very well since I had written about that and researched it in detail earlier. But I was really surprised what I found about the Eisenhower administration. And when I thought about it very as deeply as I could, I was really, I guess, almost disappointed is one of the words that I would use, at how casually that administration relied on nuclear weapons as the cheap way to guarantee security. Massive retaliation, brinksmanship, the new look, all of that set up a matrix that was the matrix that framed the entire Cold War. But it was also the matrix, the blueprint that Khrushchev followed in deciding to send his missiles to Cuba secretly. And then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was really one surprise after another. The sections that deal with Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis are unique in that there were secret tape recordings made of all his meetings. And so we see the president, how he's thinking, how he's talking to his advisors, how he begins to change his mind from initially believing the best thing to do is attack Cuba to fearing that an attack on Cuba could end up starting a nuclear war. And he's way ahead of his advisors in this form of thinking, especially his military advisors, who never give up on the idea that we really need to attack Cuba. And we would have been surprised had we attacked Cuba, but I'll leave that for another question.
Great. So Yuri, do you want to chime in?
Yes, sure. First of all, it's a great honor to be here today and to discuss Marty's book with Elaine. So thank you to everyone, Christian and Eric as well. I enjoyed Gambling with Armageddon a lot. It reads like a novel, and I don't think we could have picked a better time to discuss it while we're all grappling with what leadership means, what the consequences of political decision making are. So I think it's really important to talk about it now. And as Marty said, I would like to echo his first comment, and that's what I found really refreshing in his book, is that the framework, he talks about the long Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So the whole lead up to the crisis is something that was very refreshing to me. Of course, Hiroshima and Truman's decision to drop the bomb that forever transformed the leaders' perceptions of nuclear weapons, with Stalin rushing into a crash program and all that. But also, as he mentioned, Eisenhower's focus on nuclear weapons policy that in turn shaped the adversaries' perceptions of nuclear weapons, and then that's how it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I thought that was a very refreshing framework, and something also that Marty just briefly mentioned in his last comment is the notion or the role of advice to the president that I found that really caught my attention in the book. James Burns had an influence on Truman's decision to use the bomb on Hiroshima, but we can also think of the Bay of the Pigs episode when John Kennedy in April 1961 sensed that something was wrong about the advice that was proposed to him by Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell, but the result was a disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. And the book, I think, really shows how that event changed the president. So I was wondering if Marty could talk a little more about how that transformation in the president, in JFK, and the experience of the failure of the Bay of Pigs then led to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the comments and for bringing up the Bay of Pigs, because it's crucial. If there had been no Bay of Pigs, there would have been no Cuban Missile Crisis. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion convinced Khrushchev and Castro that the United States was going to make up for it, so to speak, but do it with American forces. Military forces. And so that was one of the motivations for Khrushchev to put these missiles in Cuba. But I want to say something else about the Bay of Pigs, and that is Kennedy made it clear, and here he was following Eisenhower, that it was when the CIA trained anti-Castro Cubans invaded Cuba, the United States was not to leave any footprints. There was not to be anything done that pointed at the United States being behind this operation. And Kennedy made that very, very clear to the CIA. But the CIA didn't believe him. And when Castro met the invaders and defeated them, everybody in the CIA and the military expected Kennedy to send in American troops. And he had said he wouldn't, and he didn't. And what's so significant about that is that it took, in my view, a lot more political courage and personal courage to say, no, I said no, and we're not going to do it. Sending in American troops in 1962 was the default that Eisenhower would have followed, that Nixon would have followed. But Kennedy was not going to do that. He had made it clear. And that is an insight, I think, into Kennedy's character. And it's an insight into the way he behaves during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, I don't talk about this in the book, but when we talk about would Kennedy have gotten involved in Vietnam the way Johnson did, I think both the Bay of Pigs, his Bay of Pigs behavior and his behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis indicate that it is very unlikely that he would have done the same thing that Johnson did.
Thanks very much, Marty. Elaine, do you want to jump back in? Unmute yourself, please. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. There's so much in what you just said, Marty, to pick up on and run with. But I think what I'll do is ask you about the personalities involved. You just now you spoke about Eisenhower and Kennedy, and your book really paints very vivid pictures of the major players in all of this, not only the very well-known ones, but the ones who aren't really well-known at all, who had an important role to play. And I wonder if you might highlight in a few comments some of your discoveries about people who we think we know about, like Stevenson, for example, who emerges in your book in a way that I have certainly never seen Stevenson written about or talked about. And there are others. So I just thought, your book, you focus quite a bit on the role of chance, but you also focus quite a bit on the role of decision-making. and the actions of individual people involved and their personalities, not just their decisions, but who they really were, what kind of people they were. And I loved that. So I don't know if you'd like to start with Stevenson, or if you have another favorite character you might like to discuss.
No, I will start with Stevenson because I think he was far more important in the Cuban Missile Crisis than he's ever been given credit for. And one of the reasons he has not been given credit for it is that Kennedy's worst instincts emerged after the crisis was over. His best instincts led to the resolution of the crisis peacefully. But his worst political instincts led him to make sure that Stevenson's role in the crisis was diminished. And one of his best friends, Bartlett, who was a journalist, wrote an article with Stuart Alsop about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy had a chance to review a draft copy of it, and he wrote in the margins, Stevenson wanted a Munich, and that became one of the highlights of the article. And the fact of the matter is that on the very first day of the crisis, Stevenson, by chance, by luck, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is filled with luck, happened to be in Washington and had an appointment with the president. The president told him about the discovery of the missiles in Cuba after lunch and after his first meeting with his advisors, and said to Stevenson, well, we're going to have to bomb or invade to get rid of those missiles. And Stevenson immediately said, oh no, this can be handled diplomatically. And we know exactly what he told the president because he wrote a memo summarizing their discussion the very next day. And I am thoroughly convinced that Stevenson's analysis impressed Kennedy, even though he didn't like Stevenson. Their intellects spoke to each other. Their personalities were like oil and water, but they were both very smart people. And one of Kennedy's best traits is that he listened and analyzed things and paid attention. And once Stevenson put the argument in front of him with details about how to go about it to end this crisis diplomatically, Kennedy absorbed that over the next day or so, especially in contrast to some of his more militaristic advisors. In effect, Stevenson was the architect of the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis because Kennedy followed everything that Stevenson said, with one exception. Stevenson wanted to give back Guantanamo. And oh, do we all wish that that had been done. But the interesting thing is that when you think about it, it was Kennedy who preferred a Munich to a nuclear war, thank God. But he put this Munich label on Stevenson. So that's one thing. Luck is popping up all over the Cuban Missile Crisis. I begin the book with the story of the Soviet submarines that one of which, that were on the quarantine line, one of which almost launched a nuclear torpedo at an American aircraft carrier and some of the ships around it. And it was really a matter of less than a minute when another officer aboard that submarine managed to see something that led him to believe that the submarine was not being attacked, but just being try to being brought to the surface, so to speak. So we really came within less than 60 seconds of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was just a very lucky moment that led to that torpedo not being fired.
Great. Well, we're getting a number of questions in the chat room, so which I want to take up in a little bit, but maybe so Yuri, do you want to have one more go at it?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to emphasize that the fact that Stevenson definitely stood out in the book. And I found it amazing that Stevenson's proposal to find a peaceful resolution was the first proposal of that kind that Kennedy encountered, as you know, Marty. And I think that Stevenson was coming from the UN environment. So I think that was played a major role, because he came with a completely different perspective into the crisis. So his focus or priorities were different. And I think he was looking at the big picture. So he was looking at the international, the world opinion and what the US allies were thinking or were feeling about a nuclear war or having nuclear weapons pointed at them. So he knew how to put himself in the other's shoes. I think that was a big component in resolving the crisis.
Absolutely. Yes. And, you know, as you was spelling that out, it occurred to me that Stevenson, because he was dealing with international diplomacy every day, had a perspective that Kennedy was sympathetic to, but Kennedy's initial instinct was, this is a US, Soviet, sort of Cuban issue. And what happens over the next few days is that Kennedy's thinking broadens and broadens to be enveloped really by Stevenson's thinking. And one of the points that I make in the book is that the United Nations played a much more important role in resolving the crisis than is generally recognized. And the fact that Stevenson was there was important in that regard.
Thank you. Great points. I want to bring in my co-chair, Eric Arneson, for a question. Eric?
Thanks, Christian. Marty, one of the things that struck me in the book was the poor quality of American intelligence. The CIA completely, as you make clear on a number of occasions, underestimated the number of Soviet officials, troops in Cuba, and the belligerence of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who just seemed to be itching to go to war all out. Could you say a little bit more about both the intelligence failures and the plans for war that the Joint Chiefs were putting forward?
Well, thank you for that, Eric, because that connects to the Bay of Pigs and it's central to the crisis. The CIA estimated that there were 11,000 Soviet troops on the island, when in fact there were 42,000. There were also tactical nuclear weapons on the island, which the United States had not discovered. So if the Joint Chiefs' enthusiasm to attack Cuba had been followed, the United States troops would have met 4 times the number of Soviet troops that they expected, and they would have been initially slaughtered on the beaches by tactical nuclear weapons. There's no way if we had attacked Cuba, that a nuclear war would not have been the result. And I think it's a general lesson about crises. You know, if we all had perfect information about the other, we would be able to manage crises much better. But it is impossible to know all of the important elements that you're dealing with in a crisis. And that's one of the huge dangers related to war in general, but especially in the nuclear age. One little mistake and, you know, it's all over.
Thanks, Marty. Let me get to a couple of questions by our viewers. The first one actually kind of follows up, overlaps to a certain extent with the question Eric just asked. It comes from Samuel Wells, of course, the author of Fearing the Worst, the latest history of the Korean War. His question is, what did JFK know about the presence of nuclear weapons in Cuba? You just spoke to that. And about the security of Soviet communications with the ships bringing more missiles.
Yes, well,
that's a bit of a twist there. And let me then sort of, go ahead. Go ahead, Marty.
Well, first of all, Sam, thanks for that question. Great book on the Korean War. The administration knew, as I said, knew nothing about the tactical nuclear weapons. They didn't know how many troops were there. And they knew that there was communication between Moscow and the ships that were heading towards the quarantine line. But all of those communications were coded, encoded, and we couldn't read any of them. So we didn't know what was going on with respect to whether or not the captains of those ships were receiving orders to ignore the blockade or to respect the blockade or not to even approach the blockade. Well, it turned out, of course, that the orders were for the ships that had sensitive cargo on board, that they turn around and not try to not give the blockade a chance to stop and inspect them. But those ships that did not have any sensitive cargo, they went through the blockade. And how Kennedy handled the blockade is very interesting. It was micromanagement from the point of view of the Chief of Naval Operations, who was very upset being told what to do. But it was an example of Kennedy's belief that you cannot trust the military to think the way you, the President of the United States, is thinking. And so he really stayed on top of it and prevented what could have been a couple of more incidents that would have taken a lot more luck to avoid a war.
Thank you. One more question on the Soviet side of the story. Question from Robert Ney. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. How much should we credit Admiral Arkhipov for not firing his nuclear torpedo? Did he really save the world?
Well, to provide some background to that, the captain of the submarine B-59 that almost fired the nuclear torpedo, his last name was Savitsky. On board his submarine, quite by chance, was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was the number 2 man in the naval staff that planned this operation. And while the captain of the submarine is the captain, Arkhipov was a very important presence. And it was Arkhipov who recognized that the United States anti-submarine forces were not trying to sink Savitsky's submarine. And it was Arkhipov who essentially countermanded the order to fire the nuclear torpedo. And so, yes, he did save the world.
Thank you. We have a question from Maiko. Why wouldn't the Kennedy administration admit that they had agreed with Khrushchev to remove the American missiles from Turkey and Italy?
Yes. One of the reasons that Khrushchev put his missiles in Cuba was that several years earlier, the Eisenhower administration had determined that American Jupiter missiles, which were also intermediate range missiles, were going to be placed in Turkey and Italy. And they were during the early days of the Kennedy administration. The question of how to end the crisis was resolved on two different issues. The first issue was Kennedy's willingness to promise that the United States would not invade Cuba, which of course was the reason Khrushchev put his missiles in Cuba. But the Jupiter missiles were a thorn in Khrushchev's side. He not only feared them, but he felt that symbolically it was an insult to the Soviet Union. So in a letter to Kennedy at the end of the crisis, he made that letter public. He offered to remove his missiles from Cuba if Kennedy removed the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, an even trade. And it is so interesting to see the discussion between Kennedy and his ex-com advisors on this issue. None of them were willing to make this trade public. But Kennedy kept saying, we're not going to have a very good war if, we could have traded missiles for missiles. But he couldn't convince his advisors that, he should do it. So he just went off and did it secretly on his own. Again, showing that he was in charge and he was absolutely determined to avoid war.
Thank you. A question from Kenton Clymer. Marty, with respect to your observation about Eisenhower being disturbingly casual, the Eisenhower administration being disturbingly casual in its approach to nuclear weapons, I wondered how that squares with the image we have of Eisenhower's comments about the use of the bomb on Japan that, quote, we didn't have to hit them with that awful thing, or words to that effect.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely amazing. I begin the chapters when I start to introduce Eisenhower with that observation that he was totally against using the atomic bombs against Hiroshima. But I say something like that mistake, from Eisenhower's point of view, happened in 1945 when Eisenhower had already won his war. In 1953, Eisenhower was president facing a problem, how to deal with the Soviet Union. And he put aside his anti-nuclear views from 1945 and adopted nuclear weapons more or less as a silver bullet. And one of the most interesting things about Eisenhower is that the contrast between what Eisenhower says to the National Security Council with respect to nuclear weapons and what he says to the American public. Totally different in many occasions. I think the later Eisenhower began to regret what the earlier President Eisenhower, had done. And he became more concerned and more worried and about nuclear weapons and nuclear war. But at the beginning in 53, 54, Eisenhower was promoting the use of tactical nuclear weapons to the National Security Council. And I have all kinds of documentation in the book about that.
Great, thank you. There's a question from your Pulitzer Prize co-winning author, Kai Bird, that I have to ask you. So Marty writes, Kai, having written this book, has your opinion of John Kennedy's Cold Warrior instincts changed?
Well, I worked on this book for about 13 years, so I really don't remember exactly what my views were before I immersed myself in this. Although I do recall being much more critical of him before I began to, I guess, try to get into his head. He was an amazingly interesting person. There were some awful things that he did, and his political instincts were razor sharp and knew no, I think, ethical boundaries. But his instincts about war and peace and what his responsibility was in that respect were insightful, were admirable. Again, to go back to the end of the crisis, it is so interesting to see this man decide that all his advisors, including his brother, by the way, just had to be ignored, and he was going to do what he felt was the right thing, which was trade the missiles in Turkey and prevent a war. There's a little story at the very end of the book. He's with his mistress that night of the 27th, the night before Khrushchev withdraws the missiles, and she reports that he says to her after he was called out of the room for telephone conversation, "I'd rather my children be red than dead." He was not an ideologue. He was a humanist.
Thank you. Question from Michael Binder. If we had not used atomic bombs to end World War II and resorted to invading Japan instead, would those weapons have been used during some other conflict, for example, Korea, because the world had to see at least once how destructive those weapons were?
That argument is made again and again, and I don't understand why the world had to see Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was quite clear that nuclear weapons were something beyond anything in human experience. And it was quite clear even before those weapons were tested. On April 25th, 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson goes to tell the new president, Harry Truman, about the atomic bomb. And he says, "We are creating a weapon that will destroy civilization. How we deal with this weapon is absolutely critical to understanding the future of humanity." So this is Stimson in April of 45, understanding the power of nuclear weapons even before the July 16th, 1945 test. Hiroshima did not save any lives. Frankly, I think there's an argument, this isn't in the book, but there is an argument that Hiroshima cost American lives, because if the atomic bomb had not been an option, it is likely that Truman would have clarified the status of the emperor earlier than we finally did. And it's possible that the Japanese would have surrendered earlier. They'd been trying to surrender for about a month and a half. That is, trying to surrender. They've been trying to work out surrender terms that were better than unconditional surrender.
Thank you. There have been a couple of questions in the chat room about Robert Kennedy's role. James Banner writes, can you say something about Robert Kennedy's and others close to Kennedy influence on the president? And
sure.
I think the same question from Henry Fetter. What is your assessment of the role played by Robert Kennedy during the crisis?
Yeah, now I think it was Elaine May who asked me about surprises. Well, that was one of the surprises I found. I mean, Robert Kennedy's book, The 13 Days, presents himself as a leading dove. Well, he was not a leading dove. We have on tape the things that he said during those 13 days. And the fact of the matter is that he was sometimes a dove, but most of the times he was a hawk. And one of the interesting things that emerges from this close study of the tapes is how John Kennedy uses Robert Kennedy as his emissary, so to speak, to the rest of the executive committee of the National Security Council, the ExComm. Robert Kennedy, when he's on his own, is a hawk. Robert Kennedy, when he's being told what to do by Jack, is a dove. And so, we have lots of different Robert Kennedys appearing, but the Robert Kennedy who is not being guided by his brother is not a leading dove by any means. And it's fascinating how he behaves.
Thank you. There's a question from Melvin Leffler. Did not Khrushchev prevent the war? If he had not agreed to withdraw, would there not have been war?
Well, Mel, that's a tough question, and I'm not surprised it's you who asked it. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted war. Khrushchev certainly did not want war. And there's a chapter in the book that talks about what it was like in the Kremlin on the night of October 22nd, before Kennedy gives his speech. Khrushchev calls the Politburo together, and they are absolutely panicked because they think Kennedy is going to announce that he's invading Cuba. And Khrushchev says, "This is horrible. It's a pity. All we wanted to do was scare them. And now it might be a war. It's a disaster." So what we have is both Kennedy and Khrushchev not wanting a war, but both of them determined to try and settle the crisis to their advantage. And in dealing with each other and not knowing the views that each other had, they are stumbling and sliding precipitously towards war. And finally, on that very last night, the reason that Khrushchev on Sunday, well, it's Sunday afternoon in Moscow, Sunday morning in the United States, agrees to withdraw the missiles is that he believes that everything is falling apart in Cuba. A U-2 plane had been shot down on Saturday and it was unauthorized. He receives a letter from Castro saying that he should fire his missiles at the United States if the United States invades Cuba. And Castro believes the United States is going to invade Cuba. So Khrushchev is in utter panic, and he ends the crisis. But Kennedy is also in something of a panic, and he makes an arrangement on Saturday night with Dean Rusk for Rusk to call a former colleague of UTAN, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and suggest to him that he propose the Jupiter-Cuban trade, and Kennedy would accept it coming from the United Nations. So there's an exit both for Khrushchev, and Kennedy has this exit. And in a sense, you know, there's almost a race to the finish line, and Khrushchev gets there first. And because he got there first, allegedly, you know, he lost and Kennedy won. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the crisis, Khrushchev saved Cuba, which was the reason for, one reason at least, for his putting missiles in Cuba. And he got a secret pledge to get rid of these Jupiters that so bothered him so much. So he got two out of his three things that he was trying to get by putting the missiles in Cuba. The third one was keeping the missiles in Cuba, which of course he didn't get.
Next question, actually right on this exchange between Kennedy and Khrushchev from Charles Mayer. Early accounts have stressed the fact that Kennedy decided not to take into account the first message from Khrushchev, but the second, more conciliatory message. Was this so crucial a factor?
Well, first, hello, Charlie. It's nice to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in. It was crucial. I mean, when Kennedy got the second letter, which remember was broadcast over Radio Moscow, so it was public. And that's the one that asked for the missile trade. He said, you know, we're not, as I said before, we're not going to have a good war if we could have traded these missiles for Turkey, for Cuba. So in effect, the myth is that he didn't pay attention to the second letter. But the truth is, he did pay attention to the second letter, and he did give Khrushchev what he wanted, which was to get rid of the Jupiter missiles. So the so-called, you know, ignoring of the second letter is, in my view, a myth.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about Castro's role in all of this. Could you talk a little bit about your view of Castro? Jack Sensor asked that question, and Bruce Newling as well.
Okay. Hi, Jack. The general view from the United States is really that Castro is not very important in all of this. It's just a US-Soviet issue. But the fact of the matter is, Castro played a critical role. Obviously, he decided to accept the Soviet missiles, which Khrushchev was not sure that he would do initially. But one of the things that I say at the end of the book is that Castro determined or helped to determine the timing of the end of the crisis. On Saturday night, he wrote a letter to Khrushchev saying that it was likely that the United States was going to invade, and if the United States invaded, Khrushchev should be the first to launch nuclear weapons against the United States, which drove Khrushchev up the wall. I mean, he just thought that, you know, this was the craziest thing he had heard, and Castro didn't understand what these missiles were all about. They were about deterrence, not starting a war. Castro also controlled the results of the crisis in the United States. Kennedy had argued that it was important for the United Nations to inspect the Soviet missiles sites to be sure all the missiles were left the Soviet Union. But Castro said, you know, absolutely not. This is, you know, Cuba is an independent country, and I have 5 demands that must be met before I will allow the United Nations to come into Cuba. And, you know, one of them was giving back Guantanamo, another was stopping harassment of Cuba, and, you know, and so on and so forth. Well, Kennedy was not going to do that. And so it was a bit humiliating for the American president to have to give up that part of what he considered the arrangement for the end of the crisis.
Thank you. We're just about running out of time, but there's one question that came in fairly early, and I just want to quickly get to that. 3 presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, had very different political careers. Truman was a lifelong politician, Eisenhower a military hero, JFK had initial experience with foreign affairs. Where do you see, or where, he asked, does the prudent attitude from JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis come from his foreign affairs experience? So where do you see this Kennedy position coming from?
Well, I think it comes.
1 minute, Marty.
Okay, I think it comes from his whole life. Certainly his experience during World War II was critical. He left the war very skeptical of senior military. His experience on the Foreign Affairs Committee as a senator gave him an understanding of the emerging third world. And he, as I said earlier, he was not an ideologue. And so his entire experiences and personality and view that the responsibility of the President of the United States was to avoid a nuclear war. He called nuclear war the final failure. And that was very different than Eisenhower, who, by the way, recommended to Kennedy that he unleash the military to invade Cuba.
Thank you. With that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Eric Arneson. Eric.
It's always unfortunate to have to draw to a close a stimulating conversation that I think we could probably carry on for much of the rest of the evening. But alas, we can't. Apologies to those of you with questions that we could not get to. And our thanks to Sayuri, Elaine, Christian, of course, Marty, and of course, Politics and Prose for this collaboration and for hosting this event this evening. Just wanted to very quickly call attention to the Washington History Seminar that will be taking place this coming Monday, October 5th, from 4 to 5:30 p.m. On a new book by G. John Eikenberry entitled A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crises of Global Order. You can simply look us up online and find the information for joining us for that event. Again, thank you very much to our panelists, our author, and Politics in Prose. And Politics in Prose will get the final word.
Well, first, let me thank Eric and Christian and Lainey and Sayuri and Politics in Prose. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent conversation, gentlemen, and all of our guests. Want to thank you all for participating, and of course, all of our attendees. Thank you all for participating. Before we all do exit, however, I wanted to ask Dr. Sherwin, we all asked this of all of our authors, are you currently reading anything? And if so, could you please share that with everyone?
Well, actually, let me be absolutely honest. I moved from a 4-story townhouse into a 1-bedroom apartment a couple of weeks ago, and all I'm doing is unpacking boxes. And as you can see, this bookshelf behind me, nothing has been done except unpacking. So right now, I'm looking forward to reading a lot, but
reading sounds much more pleasurable than unpacking.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Well, congratulations on the move. Once again, thank you everyone for participating and joining us today. And we hope everyone stays safe out there and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Hey,
And good night.
Congratulations, Marty.
thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen. Okay, Lainey, Sayuri, thank you very much.
Congratulations, Marty. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the great questions.
Thank
Eric,
you for allowing me to
okay.
be part of it. Congratulations, Marty.
Thank you. Okay.